Hey guys, how's it going? It's Will here. So in this video we're going to cover creating a configuration service for your NestJS app. So we're going to try to follow the best the best practices that are out there for configuring your app. So we're going to use a package called dotenv to read the configuration values from the operating system environment variables. The reason why you want to do this is because you never want to check in sensitive configuration data into source control, because then now it's there forever. It lives in your Git history, and you just really don't want to pollute your Git repo with this type of sensitive data. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a lib folder inside of source. So source lib is where the config is going to live. We'll create a new directory called config, and inside of config we'll create two files. One of them is going to be we'll call it the config.service, and the other one we'll create is going to be the config model. So this is going to be the actual model that's going to hold all of our data. Alright, so we got both of those created. Now we're going to do an npm install, save it to our package JSON of the .env package. Alright, so as we're waiting for that to finish, we will, that was pretty quick. So now we'll do the type definitions of .env. Let that guy install. We'll start writing our config model first. So export class config model. We're going to have a constructor in this guy, and the very first thing we're going to do is import splat as .env from .env. This package is going to be called in the constructor of the config model. This is because we want to allow the app to read all of those operating system environment variables on the process env node object. So we'll call .env.config. Alright, now we have all of those environment variables accessible via process.env. To illustrate what I mean by that, let's create a variable called, let's say, JWT secret. It's going to be a string, and we'll say, this dot JWT secret is equal to process.env dot, we'll do all caps JWT underscore secret. Alright, so, made a mistake here, process.env.jwt secret. So we will create a new file in the very root directory called .env, and this is going to be the configuration file for the app. So let's go ahead and open up the git ignore, and inside there let's make sure we have a section dedicated to our app, and we'll add .env as a file we do not want to include in the source control. Alright, just to make sure it's not getting picked up, let's do git status. We see that it is included here in source control, so let's just call git reset.env. Okay, and now it just was removed here, and it's not included in source control anymore because it was on our git ignore, but it wasn't picked up right away. Alright, so now that we have a .env file, this is going to allow us to develop locally with these environment variables, but specifying them inside this file. So JWT underscore secret is equal to super secret JWT, and we want to develop locally with this JWT secret value, but we don't want it to be checked in the source control. So that's why we're going to read it off of the process environment variable object called process.env. Alright, so now we have a config model with a JWT secret configured, and the config service now needs to be written. So we're going to do @injectable because it is going to be an injectable service. Export class config service, and this is going to have a constructor, and inside the constructor we're going to new up a new config model. So we'll call it config of type config model, and then in the constructor we'll call this .config is equal to new config model. So we're newing up a brand new config model that's going to now be inside the config service. This config service can now be injected into any of our other controllers and services as long as we include it into the app module, or whatever module you want your config to live in. So you could create another module within the config folder called config module, and then import that config module here, like config module, and then now your app controller and users controller can access that config service. We're not going to create a config module for this example. We're just going to simply import it as a provider directly, so config service, and now since it's a provider, the users controller can access it. So if I go to the users controller and I have essentially no constructor, but I will create one. We'll create a private config service of type config service, and now I've just dependency injected in a config service into this constructor. So now I have access to my config service within my user's controller. So whenever my user's controller is booted up, when the app module boots up this user's controller and it's created, I can now use this config service anywhere I need to within this user's controller. So let's go ahead and just console log out, just as an example, this .config service .config .jwt secret. Alright, so remember, config service .config, that .config is that config model that lives in the config service. It's created when we new up a new config model, and this config model, when it's created, it will actually call .env config, which if you're running the app locally, it's going to read in the environment variables from this file here, .env. It's a standard file name, so make sure it's .env. Make sure you've provided your environment variable with the same name here as the tag you're using on the process env. If those things are identical, you will read in the value in this .env file. Alright? When you're in production, .env will not read in a .env file. If you don't have this .env present, it won't read it in. And that way you will essentially get the true process env environment variable that's coming from the Linux box or Docker container or whatever you're using in your deployment environment. Okay, so that's pretty much it. So if we boot up the app, we should see a console log coming out of the user's controller that shows us we have now injected the config service. And yep, here we are. This config service config.jwt secret is equal to super secret JWT. And now I can actually commit this to my source control and see nothing in here has my super secret JWT variable. It's not going to be in my git source control. So I'll do a git commit config service. And now I'm rest assured that there's no sensitive information checked into my source control. Alright guys, well that's about it for this video. Make sure you like and subscribe, and I hope this was helpful. Thanks.